but at the same time, in trying to sell the book, it got us into trouble a little bit. So the preface that you see at the front of books is designed to explain to people the nature of your book, and hopefully to convince them that it's something that they should buy. And so we decided to tell them right up front what kind of book this was. And one of the phrases that we said was, just as you do not need to be an automobile mechanic to drive a car, you don't need to be a statistician to use multivariate data analysis. Well, that's the logic of the book. It's the purpose of actually writing it, because in those days, that was when software was emerging, and people were becoming interested in statistics, and yet there were many of them that were similar to me, not really wanting to get into solving equations, but wanting to learn how to use statistics to help us solve problems. So in fact, one of the reasons that we had a problem with publishers is that they typically, in deciding whether they would publish a book or not, would send it to individuals to say, what do you think of this book? Should we publish it? Well, it's a stats book. Who do they send the book to say, is this something that has a market for it? Statisticians. And statisticians read the preface and they say, you're insulting us. Well, you know, my marketing skills came in handy there, and that was what eventually enabled me to find a publisher and convince the publisher to actually publish the book. A friend of mine introduced me to a publisher that was a small publisher, and I took him out to dinner with my first co-author, and we bought him a nice dinner and lots of good wine and whatever, and when he was feeling very good, we said, you really need to publish this. Will you publish it? And he said, yes. The next morning, came back to him and I said, remember what you told us last night? What did I tell you? You told us you would publish the book, and that's how we got started with it. So, as an example of how naive and young I was, along with my colleagues, I didn't at one point have hair. But when my son became 15 and started driving, you know, that scares you a little bit when they get on the road, running around at night doing things. So the journey started, and that's what I looked like when we were writing the first chapters back in the early 1970s. But fortunately, the journey's been very good. We went from the small publisher to the large publisher, and Pearson had it for many years. And then the publishing industry has had some trouble, at least in the U.S. in the last few years. And so we're now with Cengage Learning in the U.K., which is good from your perspective because the U.S. publisher was charging $280 US for the book, and when it came to England, the UK, they're now only charging about $80 US. So from a student perspective, it's much better. Let's move along from talking about how the book and the journey actually started to the historical perspectives about statistical analysis in general. The method of analyzing data and applying statistics and probability theory really got started in the early 1900s. So we've had statistical analysis for about 100 years. In the early years, it was slow in moving along because we didn't have computers, we didn't have software, but the basic concepts of correlation and regression and factor analysis and so forth were worked out and actually began to be applied. Beyond that, it took us until the 70s and the 80s when we first had good software, and it exploded quite rapidly. And in the late 70s and early 90s, which I know some of this is in a time before any of you were even born. But we made a lot more progress since then. But the first examples and applications of structural equation modeling really emerged in the early 80s with the software, and particularly if you've used structural equation modeling, they emerged with the Literal software. Fortunately, we have much better software today that runs faster and actually works when you try to run it. In those days, the software blew up or didn't work, or you ended up, after you had used Fortran to program it to work with, let's say, a backward slash instead of a forward slash, and of course it doesn't run. Even if everything was perfect, it took us a week to 10 days to get a program processed in the computers based upon the technology available in those days. Well, the 1990s were really great because we began to have desktop PCs and we had better software, and students were more receptive to it. And we began with what we call now the big data concept, or the explosion in data. And so with data comes the challenge of what do we do with it? How do we use it to, in fact, advance knowledge? And of course, we had the point and click and the drag and drop interface, and that too made students much happier about learning a little bit about this weird field of statistics. You know, Jose was telling me just yesterday about some of his challenges in translating the book, and I think you said that there were probably several hundred words in statistics which were not in Spanish at all, and so they had to determine how they were going to deal with that. When you try to learn multivariate data analysis, you have to learn vocabulary. And so the concepts of the words like homoscedasticity and heteroscedasticity, and even something like parsimony are really difficult, even if you are an English speaker as a first language, not to mention Spanish with English as a second or third or perhaps fourth language. So obviously after the 2000s, we had a lot of improvements in social sciences research, and particularly with statistical analysis, and some new techniques that had been around for a while, people began writing about them, including not just traditional covariance-based sim, but partial least squares, which has become my passion in the last 10 years. The previous edition of my multivariate book was published in 2009, and in that particular edition of the book, there were only 3.5 pages on partial least squares. 10 years later, we have an entire chapter, but we have entire books. So the explosion of a simple to use, I say simple, for first-time statisticians, it's not so simple, but it's simple to learn if you invest in a little time. So anyway, we've got many expansions of a very sophisticated but helpful system of equations that help us to analyze all this data that we have. So we move into the era then of big data and data analytics, which is really a fancier way, or at least the way to try to impress people other than saying multivariate data analysis, which is the fundamental approach. I mentioned that the early days of statistics were in the 1900s, but actually there was some excellent research being conducted with structural equation modeling. One of my co-authors, Barry Babin, and I searched using Google Scholar, and we were interested because we've written a lot in the area of structural equation modeling. We were interested in what was the first article ever published with structural equation modeling. And we found this, we believe it's the first one, 1921, and in fact, it's become and really became a seminal piece of research, and I'll tell you about why, but it became a seminal piece of research, not just in the area of farming and agricultural research, but now in business. You notice, if you're familiar with some, you notice a couple of differences. The independent variables are on the right, and the dependent variables are on the left. And of course, he had to draw his model, his structural model, by hand. So that, in fact, is a little bit different. The topic was predicting the birth weight of guinea pigs. Excited? Why was this a problem? Well, in those days, we were a farming economy in the U.S. and really in the world. The problems that scientists and scholars were facing were, how do we improve the production in the farming sector? He was using guinea pigs because he could test them in the lab. Eventually, this led to its application with other livestock like pigs and horses and cows. And the specific problem that he wanted to look at was, how can we maximize the birth weight? Why would he be interested in that? Well, the higher the birth rate, the greater the likelihood of survival, and the shorter the period between birth and maturity when you can sell your livestock. So it began with guinea pigs in a lab, and it was extended to other kinds of livestock in terms of optimizing the growth cycle, the birth and the growth cycle of livestock in general. I said this was a seminal piece of research, so let's come forward a little over 100 years. This same approach on birth rate is being used with structural equation modeling. It's in the U.S., it's in Germany, it's in the UK, but what are they using now? Well, have you heard of facial recognition? We think of it generally by the law enforcement people for identifying criminals or bad guys or something, but facial recognition is being used with livestock in areas that they're growing the livestock. And they individually identify the cows and the pigs and the horses and so forth. And they also individually hook up sensors. They change the music. They adjust the temperature. And they're using it to learn the optimum method of, in fact, growing to the highest birth rate in the shortest period of time. And that's actually happening. Can you believe that? It's amazing what they're doing, but by the way, that's one of the sources of obtaining new data. And we talk about the explosion in data, just one example of where it comes from. That piece of research with structural equation modeling has made food cheaper and life better in a lot of ways. So where are we today? Wow, this thing's loud. We like to make up things and have fun, and so I made up the word demystification, which is basically taking the mystery out of statistics. And that was really the fundamental objective of our research and our writing in the early years, and ultimately the writing of the book. To take the mystery out of something that was difficult to learn because the statisticians, not understanding anything about marketing and sales, liked the fact that they were on a pedestal and respected because there were so few of them to actually know about statistics. Well, you don't need to be a trained statistician. I can say this now without getting in trouble. The statisticians, in fact, are now envious because my books sell a lot better than their books. And of course, the students are happier too, because instead of having to solve equations, they in fact can learn what you actually do with these strange kinds of mathematical formulas. By the way, if we've got some mathematicians or statisticians, we know and respect you, so I'm not trying to insult you. But what do you really need to know beyond being just a little bit familiar with the statistical analysis? Well, you need to know research design. How do you design a study so that you control for factors that might come in from the outside and influence it? You need to choose the correct method. You need to apply it correctly. You need to, in fact, examine the assumptions and determine that you haven't violated any of the assumptions. One of the really good things about partial least squares, which we've become very good at applying, is that the assumptions are very loose, or they're very liberal. One of the things that you've probably learned about is the normal distribution, and it makes it rather restrictive, particularly in the social sciences where our research is, because you almost never find social sciences data that is normally distributed. So having a statistical method that in fact enables you to analyze and accurately find good solutions is very good and helpful for social scientists like myself and like most of you. Finally, the thing that I teach a lot of my students, or really try to teach them all, but some don't really learn as good as I would like, is I want them to learn how to identify what I call the red flags. If you apply a method, don't just believe that everything that you get, particularly the first or the second time, is really correct. So red flags are things like, what if the relationship or the hypothesis is supposed to be positive and the results are negative? Recognize it and question it. Maybe it is different because your data is different than previous research. But if it's different, just make sure that you can defend it and justify the fact that it is correct. Your work is correct, because the last thing we want to do is publish something that's incorrect. So identify the red flags so that you can find the solution to actually determine that it's correct and not make a fool of yourself by representing something that as being correct when in fact it's not. I think we've got a lot of academics in here. We are increasingly required to publish, and I often get questions about how do you get published? People go to the individuals like myself that have been fortunate, and they say, what are the tips about getting published? Well, I often look and reflect on that, and one of the things that I studied a number of years ago, again with my colleague and co-author Barry Babin and another former student of mine, was the idea of the utilization of SIM in your research and to analyze your data. So my comment up there is, are you using SIM? You should be, because the results of our study actually demonstrated that. Barry was associate editor of the Journal of Business Research for many years, and in order to answer that particular question, we randomly selected a 6-month period of all the articles submitted to the Journal of Business Research. Just as an indication, the Journal of Business Research receives about 12,000 journal articles where people want it to be published every year. So we selected a 6-month period, and we pulled out those journal articles that were desk rejected. So all of the journal articles that went to the first review was our population. And we analyzed it in terms of the typical things that the reviewer looks at. And these are the results averaged over all of those journals. And what you notice is, if the article included structural equation modeling, that these numbers in the structural equation modeling column are consistently higher than if there was no structural equation modeling. And the ones that are red in the middle are statistically significantly higher. But they're all higher. So in general, when we think about that, it indicates at least, that it has some influence on the likelihood of the success of being accepted. But that is a little bit naive in terms of actually saying that's the only thing that influences it. If you've ever run structural equation modeling, you know that in order to get a good solution, you must invest a lot of time in identifying your research questions, designing your hypothesis, collecting the data. So the effort on the front end to really get a good solution with SIM is a lot more than simply running a descriptive survey. We believe that above and beyond the idea that people were getting better reviews just for using SIM, is that if they did use SIM and they got a solution that would be considered acceptable in the journal, they have already invested a lot more time than those that did not use SIM. Now, there are some exceptions to that. For example, if you do experiments using multiple analysis of variance or simple analysis of variance, is an excellent approach. But we do see that, in fact, SIM probably has at least some influence. Another question that I get is there a bias? Are U.S. authors getting some favoritism because they're from the U.S.? Well, I want to, say perhaps they are, but I think that probably that is a result of the fact that the U.S. was one of the first countries to begin using structural equation modeling, and so therefore they have more experience in using it. But if you look at what we've done here, by the way, this is not the best design, but it's the only thing that we could do. The way we divided between U.S. authors and non-U.S. authors was there at least a single author from the U.S.? Well, I know that many of you have been on the faculty for a short period of time, and you've been listed as an author. So if you were at a university, you might be listed at a U.S. university. So that in itself doesn't necessarily mean that they were all U.S. authors. So the division was, if there's one, then we would classify it as U.S. authors. What you do notice is that if you apply structural equation modeling, it is rated higher, and it's rated higher whether it's a U.S. author or a non-U.S. author. But overall, what you also see is that the high ratings are consistently associated with the application of that method. Well, make up your mind. Should you be using? Should you not? I would like to see you use SIM more, because that would, you would have to learn more about it. And since I have the leading book, then you buy my book, and I make a little more money. Always about marketing. Well, we've got what's been labeled by statisticians as first-generation method, things that I assume most of you have used at least a few of these methods. The second generation that we've labeled these are the structural equation modeling. And there are two kinds of structural equation modeling. Many people, even in the U.S., I estimate that as much as 80% of the scholars in universities do not even know there are two kinds of structural equation modeling. Because the partial least squares approach has only been recently spread through the universities and the scholars in the social sciences. So initially, people were trained on literal, the covariance-based SIM. More recently, because we now have good software, partial least squares has begun to be applied, and that's the reason that some of us as scholars have begun writing in the field as well. So when we look at the growth, what you can see is that in the early years, and these numbers are in the range of 3 or 4 articles per year in the top management, marketing, and information systems journals. So until about 2005, when the Smart PLS software came out, you can see that in 3 disciplines, there's still fewer than 15, ranges about 12 or 14 articles a year in those journals. Fortunately, we've now been presenting seminars and workshops, and we reached the point where we've got considerably more, basically an explosion in its application. So if you have never used partial least squares, I advise you that you should take a look at it. And one of the criticisms of it, there have been some people who have not always supported it, but one of the interesting criticisms that I got from one of the scholars in the U.S. was that individual didn't like the method because they always got a solution. I said, what do you mean? Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Aren't we supposed to get a solution? Well, that individual was one of the covariance-based SIM people, and they're so used to not really getting a solution, not being able to apply it and get a solution that works, that they felt like anything that consistently gets a solution couldn't be good. Oh well, we now have moved into what I refer to and what many of us in the area of structural equation modeling think of as third generation statistics. And they still have a lot of structural equation modeling, but the big thing that we have today that we didn't have before this era is a lots of data. And I've been talking about big data. I'll be honest with you, I didn't invent the term big data, but I've been talking about the explosion in data for about 25 years. And it wasn't until about the last few years when people actually knew what I was talking about or even understood the concept of data. So when we think about it, why is it called big data? Well, number one, there's a lot of it. It's emerging from a lot of different places, but it's not just emerging in a lot of places. It's difficult to, in fact, collect it, to process it, to search through it, to store it. It previously was very expensive. Fortunately, it's not nearly as expensive today as it was before. And there are a number of people that maybe they're overstating this a little bit, but they basically are saying it's shaping the world around us. Whether we talk about the idea of at work, or whether it's at play, or whether it's at the companies and the governments that we work for, that it truly is shaping the world. And I believe it, being invested in it. If you haven't thought about it, just think about the smartphone that you have today, the wearable watches that not just tell you the time, but they monitor your heartbeat and so forth. And there are individuals who actually say the wearables that are helping them to monitor their health have identified the fact that they're going to have a heart attack, and they say it saved their life. So that's producing data. One of the things about data that you probably don't understand is that it's estimated that about 90% of the data that we are collecting today is what's called unstructured data. Only about 10%, maybe less by now, is actually the numbers that we collect in a lot of the secondary data. So what is unstructured data? Well, unstructured data is something like the sensors that I mentioned earlier on the cattle that are testing the effect of music and temperature and so forth. It's facial recognition. It is, and I'm not sure if this is true in Spain, but in the US, you often get a message when you call a company, and the message says that this conversation is going to be recorded and you need to understand that, and if you don't like it, you're going to hang up. Well, those conversations are being recorded, many of them, more than you think, and someone has to take the words and the phrases in that conversation and go through it and identify. And they look for phrases and words and things that they think are either positive or negative. But when it starts out with a recording, that's unstructured data. And about 90% of what we are getting today is unstructured data. The first person first author that I read about this was in about 1990, and probably most of you have not read Thriving on Chaos. If you haven't read it and you like to look back and reflect on what was happening 30 years ago, I would suggest you did. But I really like this phrase, we're drowning in information and we're starved for knowledge. Basically, what he was advocating is that we needed to take the information and we needed to convert it into a form that's usable. And he was writing about this almost 30 years ago. One of the things that he also mentioned is he said that in those days, data, information in corporations, even big corporations, was what he referred to as a waste byproduct. And what's happened in the last 30 years or so is what was previously a waste byproduct being produced but not collected or organized and stored is now being used and is being accumulated. Unfortunately, there are not enough data scientists, there are not enough students, there are not enough employees who understand statistical analysis well enough to help, in fact, analyze that and understand it and use it. So I would advise you that, in fact, you need to encourage your students to learn more about it, because I know that in the U.S. there are literally thousands, and when I'm talking about thousands, really it's in the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are forecasted to be needed in the next few years. And there will be jobs, and they do pay good. In the U.S., a starting individual with a master's degree makes in the range of about $180,000 to $200,000 a year in the data scientist area. So it is a good opportunity for your students. A number of individuals have talked about how much is it really growing. Well, this is a general statement as well, but you know, it's not really specific, but it's the general trend. It's estimated that in the next 3 years, humanity will generate more data than it has in the past 1,000 years, nearly all digital, from phones and Facebook and social media and all that. It's a lot, whatever you want to put in terms of the number, whether it's the past 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever. It's lots of data. And multivariate data analysis and statistical analysis, people who have those skills will be good, will enjoy good success in the employment field. So we talk about trying to estimate this. I picked up a statement that says the total amount of information in 2014, 4.4 zettabytes, and it's going to reach 44 zettabytes just next year. Who knows what a zettabyte is? Anybody know what a zettabyte is?
No.
You know what a gigabyte is? These are the words that are being used by data scientists to actually measure how much data is in fact being accumulated. So maybe you don't worry about those kinds of words unless you're going to be in the field, because I have to tell you, zettabytes is what characterizes the amount of information that we're looking at today. It's an entire new language there, because terabytes, petabytes, exabytes, zettabytes, yottabytes. That sounds like something you're going to eat, right? But anyway, there will be other words to describe this growth in terms of the amount of data that's exploding. When I was first reading the book in 1990, the author of the book said he felt like, and again this was his best estimate, that only about 5% of all the data that we had was actually being converted into knowledge. And that definition of what knowledge is really was, it was useful for making business decisions or really making life decisions. He projected that we would improve the situation over the next 10 or 15 years. Unfortunately, my opinion and a number of other data scientists, scholars, and statisticians are saying instead of making ground, we've lost ground. And the reason is that the data is growing so much faster than our ability to convert it. But at least we have the data, and we are able to make a lot of decisions. When you talk to people in marketing departments in the U.S., and we interact with them quite a bit, they are frightened about dealing with customers and a little bit frustrated because today customers often know more about their product than they do as individuals. And they find themselves trying to convince customers that a product is something that they should buy because the customer knows more about answering questions or asking questions than they really know how to answer. So what's occurring, producing it? Well, I mentioned to you the example of sensors and so forth, but when was the last time you went to the UK? I don't know how many cameras you have here, but in London alone, there are an estimated 600,000 cameras, probably more today, because this is about a 2-year-old statistic. And the other statistic that I saw is that in the entire country, there's more than 5 million, and that a typical individual, if you walk down the street, you were filmed over 700 times a day. There's a picture of you in their database. Lots of data. In terms of storage costs, I mentioned to you that we're not able to store in data. We couldn't collect it because we couldn't afford to store it. In 1992, the cost of storing 1 megabyte of data, again, it's a small amount, but was $15 US. Today, it's 1/3 of a penny. That's why we can store that data. And of course, the other thing about it is where we're storing a lot of that data is in a place called Iceland. Because you need to have control of the temperature, and if you store that data in cold climates, then you don't have energy costs. But we think of other things like the number of photographs that are uploaded on a daily basis to Facebook, and the number of searches on Google, which I've mentioned to you over here. 185 billion Facebook photos currently being stored. I say currently, this is about a year ago, so there's more than that today, obviously. Lots of stuff being uploaded, lots of data. Does anybody have a Google account here? My Google account? Well, my Google account is collecting a lot of data on you. One individual that was reported in the literature said he decided to measure or to count how much data was collected on him, and in 1 year they collected 72,000 pieces of data, give or take a little bit, and stored it on his My Google account about his activities on the internet. Wow. Google has trackers on 76% of all the websites in the world, except China. But anyway, that's still 76. Wow. But Facebook has 28 million. Everywhere, those trackers are identifying where we're going, what we're doing with our time, and collecting data. A company called United Parcel Service, we call it UPS, studies and uses big data, and they actually studied the number of left turns that the drivers, this is the last mile that connects people to delivery, the number of left turns that the drivers were making and how much it slowed them down. And they said that they're saving, at that point in time, about $600,000 a year. By now, I'm sure it's over $1 million a year, and that's a lot of money in terms of saving just from collecting that data. I mentioned something about smartphones. If you have been in India You may realize there's a lot of people, or you read about it. Well, there's 1 billion plus mobile phone subscribers there. In China, 1.4 billion. In the U.S., we're a small market. 330 million plus subscribers. But in fact, they make more money because most of the people in the U.S., or many of the people, have Apple. And of course, Apple is going for the premium size of the market. Phones gather data every minute, every second. So when we look at it, I skipped over that. 5 billion mobile devices next year, increase by, actually that number is from last year. So about 2 years, gonna grow by 50%. Again, collecting data. Data is changing the world. I mentioned that earlier. It's changing you and I. It is changing the corporation, the places that we work. Historically, data has been managed and controlled by the Chief Information Officer. In the last couple of years in the U.S., the control has gone from the information officers, the chiefs who control it and have been controlling it, to line managers. If you think about the job of a CIO, that individual is thinking about security. What are line managers thinking about? Selling. They're marketers. Okay? Well, probably that results in, or at least caused to some extent, the breach at Equifax, which is a company in the U.S. that collects data about our activities. Now, the U.S. is lagging, I think, unfortunately, behind Europe in terms of data privacy, particularly with the introduction of your Data Privacy Act last year. That's, I think, good, but it also makes, in some ways, it makes it more difficult to benefit from it. Another thing that you may not be aware of is that in the top listed companies, about 15% of the CEOs are currently data scientists who do not have an MBA. We have been depending in the business college for years on growing MBAs to move up to a higher level. If we're not careful, the data scientists, who in many instances are not in the business college, are going to be moving to the top and influencing business and organizations where we want to place our students. So I'm not going to talk about all these. We'd be here a long, long time. But I've worked for some of these and I've studied some of it. And all of these companies are known. They're written up in the literature for having made a lot of money or saved a lot of money from using data to make decisions. I know that it's true in Europe, it's true in the U.S. You see this little IRS internal, the Treasury Department. They are using multivariate data analysis to analyze our tax returns and find out who the cheats are. So be careful. Increasingly, they are going to find you and run you down. So I noticed when I was flying in here, and Jose Luis told me that there are lots of orange trees here. Minute Maid, I'm not sure if Minute Maid probably sells here, but this company built what it says, at least it reported in Business Week last year, that they in fact built the largest orange juice manufacturing plant in the world. And the reason that they wanted to do it is that they are selling globally and they wanted to be able to satisfy their customers. If you know a little bit about oranges, and actually Gabby told me this morning that the oranges here are a little tart and that they make marmalade but not sweet orange juice. Well, oranges grow only seasonally. Usually they produce oranges from sometime around October through January or February when it's been too cold. And when I was younger, I grew up in Florida, and there were orange trees everywhere. And my perception of orange trees is I would get up in the morning, and if I wanted my orange juice, my mother would say, go out in the back and pick some oranges and bring them in. And so we would make it. And when the oranges were tart, which we have seasonal ones, sometimes they're tart, sometimes they're sweet. She'd say put a little sugar in it. So that was the production of oranges when I was a kid many, many years ago. Minute Maid is selling different kinds, over 100 different flavors, or formulations of it, some with pulp, some without pulp, some sweeter, whatever. And they built this plant so that they could produce many different types of orange juice, because different countries, the people in different countries, like their orange juice differently. And they want it to be consistent, and they want it year-round. They don't just want it in the season when the oranges are growing. Minute Maid, this was based on an article in Business Week, Minute Maid uses data analysis and has data scientists to help them to localize the production of their orange juice that they deliver throughout the globe. So my question I want to pose to you, how many different pieces of data or points of data do they have in their database that they analyze to serve all the markets globally? It's a number you wouldn't believe. 1 quintillion. Whatever that number is, decision variables go into analyzing and producing orange juice that is consistent for a marketplace. Because if it's not consistent, people decide to go to your competitor. So I know we're getting short of time. Let me talk again about one other company that you probably are familiar with, Coca-Cola, and also Pepsi, soft drinks. I learned a little bit about this when I was in Atlanta for 11 years, because that is, in fact, the home of Coca-Cola. The question I would pose to you is, let's think about soft drinks. How many Coca-Cola soft drinks are opened every second of every day, 24/7? Somebody guess.
1 million.
1 minute. Fooler. I always fool people with this question, because they don't hear me say every second of every minute of every hour. That's just a very small item. What? Got a guess? 5? Let's go with that. Actually, it's 8,000. So you can think about it like this: 8,000, 16,000, 24,000, 32,000. Never stops. But I'm warning you, you probably know this, with today's technology in the classroom. About 2 years ago, I gave that example, and a student raises his hand. He was very respectful, and he said, no, that was back when I was telling people it was like 7,000. And he said, you're wrong, I calculated, because he used his smartphone, and he went on the website, and he took the information off of the website and calculated. So they have access to information and can challenge you. But I do know that that 8,000 is correct. And think about this. What is a soft drink? Colored, flavored, carbonated, sweetened or unsweetened water. And have they ever done a very good job selling you on buying soft drinks? Lots of success, and Coca-Cola and Pepsi have both been known for using data analytics and increasingly big data. Where did the name Coca-Cola come from? Anybody know?
Cocaine.
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 Right. Coca-Cola came from cocaine. This is an advertisement from 1876. An intellectual beverage. That's for something like we would want. Temperance drink contains the valuable tonic and nerve stimulant properties of the coca plant. Delicious, exhilarating, refreshing, invigorating, a valuable brain tonic, a cure for all nervous affections, sick headache, neuralgia, hysteria, melancholy. You probably want some of that now. You couldn't get away with that, what we would generally call puffery today. But in combination with having until 1921 was when the government made them take the cocaine out of it. It was certainly that kind of drink. One test here, I hope you can read this, but this is an example of how artificial intelligence and big data are coming into our life. So the question is, are sports writers really necessary? What are sports writers? They are writing up the results of a football game or a baseball game, and they're describing what happened. So one of these was written by artificial intelligence and the other two by a person. So if you can read that, I want you to read it and tell me which one you think was artificial intelligence. Anybody want to guess? I sensitize you too much about my questions. Come on, somebody tell me one. How many people think that one was artificial intelligence? All right, we got a few. We got 3 people. How many think that 2 was artificial intelligence? Nobody thinks 2 is artificial. What about 3? Anybody think 3? Sorry, it was number 2. Number 2 was written by artificial intelligence because data was fed to it on the number of runs and the number of, and what inning it was, and a computer wrote it. And so the question I pose to you is, does it apply to us at the university? Can the robots be replacing us? I don't know. There is a shortage of priests in the U.S. There's probably a shortage in a lot of places. I was telling Jose Luis that appeared in Business Week again. They have a robot now that is interacting with individuals spiritually where they have a shortage of priests. When I told my wife that I was going to use that in my example, she says, don't, because you might upset people. But I just had to share it because I think, wow, can you believe that there will be other kinds of situations that we wouldn't expect people to? We've got some challenges, data scientists, understanding the analysis, vision by managers to really appreciate the fact that data is important, and of course the privacy issues. It is not going to be easy to deal with that, as life in general is often increasingly not so easy. There are some other third-generation issues and challenges that are emerging. Partial least squares, we're working on new methods. We're looking at how we can improve the ability to predict it. We're working to adapt partial least squares to hierarchical linear multiple level modeling. Concept called unobserved heterogeneity. What if you forget to collect data on a particular topic? It will go through and analyze your results and identify possible things, issues, data issues that are influencing your results and suggest to you what the possibilities are. We've got continuous moderators, we've got moderated mediation and mediated moderation and cascaded moderators, all these new concepts, even Bayesian structural equation modeling. This, to me, is the area that's going to be emerging and challenging people in the third generation. It's just beginning. Get ready for it. So let's finish up. I know you have other things to do. I think, and so do the other data scientists, that obviously data is going to be expanding, continuing to increase exponentially. The analytics, the data analysis that we have is going to be more powerful. going to be easier to use. We'll have artificial intelligence that's going to be doing it to some extent. More people know about machine learning and what it's doing for us than I would have ever thought they would, but they're at least talking about it. It's going to be used in new applications, as I mentioned a couple here, that we really never thought about. And finally, the management decisions we make, the personal decisions that we make, and the decisions as faculty and students that they will be making increasingly are going to be based on the ability and the extent to which we take this mountain of data and convert it into knowledge that helps us to solve our challenges as a society and really at our level in universities in a much more effective way than we have in the past. So thanks for coming. It was a lot of fun for me. I hope it wasn't too bad for you. And I have my cards here. I'll be glad to share them with you. And by the way, if you ever need a stats book, I can tell you about a few that are really good. Thanks a lot. I also know a marketing book. I write more than just stats. Whatever. What's the next step?
Question?
Anybody have any questions?
Anybody?
Okay.
Professor, one question. We realize the future is increasing the amount of data we will have to manage in the future. So my question is, which method can we use to analyze them? Which methods are you developing to the treatment of this amount of data in the near future? So in 2 years, 3 years, no more.
Actually, people would accuse me of being biased, but partial least squares is, I believe, going to be the fundamental method of analysis because it is so flexible in its ability to deal with data, which is increasingly problematic. I mean, we have more data, but we have more problems with data. And so I think that the core method, the backbone, will be, it's already has been the backbone data analysis technique in industry for many years. European Customer Satisfaction Index, the American Customer Satisfaction Index, industry in general has been using it. It just now is finally emerging from behind the wall. So to me, it is going to be fundamental because you can use it not just because of the flexibility of the data, but you always get solutions. And I believe it was George Hensler, or one of our colleagues, he did a simulation, and I think he ran a PLS model with 250,000 variables. And you know, it's so flexible in terms of its ability to look at large databases that are really messy databases. So I see that as really being the backbone with the ability to extend it and connect other kinds of techniques like cluster analysis and so forth. And we also will be moving ahead with the machine learning component. Of course, the machine learning is where we teach the computers to do what we have tried to do, but to do it faster and more effective. But thank goodness machines are not yet as intelligent, and hopefully will never be as intelligent as we are. So the scientists like you and I, at least for the foreseeable future, will have a role not only in designing and explaining how to use machine learning, but in modifying it to improve our ability to analyze and to use that data to obtain solutions. Can we go get a beer? I'm thirsty.